right? We're losing our autonomy for a lot of social programs. You know, if women get married, they lose those social programs, right? So why would they, right? In a lot of low income areas. Or if you look at how social programs worked in Rome, I mentioned those two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Well, one of the major reform programs they start is what's called the grain dole, meaning that the Roman government, for people of a certain class, would feed you. That was the part of the conversation on Order of Man I most wanted to land carefully. And we covered so much ground in nearly an hour, I never fully developed it. Because here's the actual mechanism Ryan and I were circling. We talk about the fall of Rome as if it happened to a civilization. But civilizations are made of men, and men are made by institutions. And the institution Rome was actually built on, the one underneath every legion, every Senate vote, every emperor, was the Roman household and the Roman father who ran it. That institution didn't fall in 476. That institution had been hollowed out for almost 600 years before the Western Empire formally ended. The father had been stripped of his economic centrality, his legal authority, his religious function, and his civic role in a sequence of state interventions that each individually looked like progress. By the time Rome fell, the institution that had formed Roman men for 8 centuries was no longer functioning. Rome didn't run out of men. Rome ran out of the institution that produced the kind of men that Rome needed. This is the pattern I didn't finish. How empires take away their fathers, why each step in the process looks like a reasonable accommodation, and why Ryan's audience, men trying to figure out what they're for, in a civilization that keeps telling them they're not for much, has the strongest reason to understand this mechanism clearly. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This is the Roman Pattern. I'm the CEO of Command Your Brand, and you can find us at commandyourbrand.com. If you came here from Order of Man, welcome. Ryan and I covered Maximus Thrax, the household, the grain dole, Caesar, Cato the Younger, the 3rd century crisis, the Caracalla citizenship expansion, sexual immorality as a fall of Rome cause, and what a man can actually do in his life. The video focuses on one specific thread underneath all of it, the Roman father as the institutional foundation of Roman civilization, and what happened to him. Before I get into the framework, I owe you a few corrections on the record. First, when I said Maximinus Thrax was 7 feet tall, that's the legend, not the measurement. The ancient sources, particularly the Historia Augusta, describe him as enormous, but modern estimates based on what we know about his armor and the period's measurements put him closer to 6 feet 8 inches. Still extraordinarily tall for 3rd century Romans, but not 7 feet. The Roman habit of mythologizing exceptional figures matters here, because it's part of why we romanticize the period. But I should be honest about which numbers are legend and which are documented. Second, when I said Caracalla's citizenship expansion in 211, it was 212. This Constitutio Antoniana, the reasoning behind it is exactly what I described in the conversation. A bankrupt treasury, the need for new tax base, and the secondary effects of diluting what Roman citizenship actually meant. The date is 1 year off in the conversation. Third, when I said the Gracchi reform fed people, that's true in effect, but imprecise in mechanism. Gaius Gracchus's Lex Sempronia Frumentaria in 123 BC set a fixed subsidized grain price below market. It wasn't strictly free. The free grain toll, the frumentatones, came later under Clodius in 58 BC. The principle was established by the Gracchi. The full version arrived a generation later. The distinction matters because it shows how the policy escalated once the principle was accepted. With those corrected, here's the framework. To understand what happened to Rome, you have to understand what Rome actually was. Not what we think it was when we picture marble columns and red-plumed legionaries. What it actually was as a society. Rome was a confederation of households. Roman law wasn't built around the individual. It was built around the familia, the household. Citizenship wasn't something a man held on his own. Citizenship was something a man held because he was the head of the household. The Senate was composed of household heads. Public virtue was developed in the household and expressed in the state. The state was downstream of the household, not upstream of it. The man at the head of each Roman household was the Paterfamilias. The Romans also called him Dominus, or Lord. He held a legal authority called the Patria Potestas and was unique in the ancient world. He had legal power over his wife, his children, his slaves, his property. Until well into the imperial period, he technically held the ius vitae necesque, the right of life and death, over his own children, not as a metaphor, as a legal fact. That sounds harsh to modern ears, but the authority came with a corresponding burden. The Paterfamilias was responsible for his own household's economic survival, military service, civic participation, religious observation, and moral formation. He represented the household in commerce. He represented the household in a war. He represented the household in religion. The household had its own cult, its own ancestor worship, its own household gods, and the father was their priest. He represented the household in politics. The household was him, legally speaking, and he was the household, civically speaking. This institution is what made Rome work for 800 years. Roman men knew exactly what they were for, because the institution that formed them defined it precisely. And then, starting in 123 BC, the state began absorbing the paterfamilias' functions one by one. The transfer happened in 4 stages across roughly 600 years. Each stage, at the time, looked like reasonable policy. The cumulative effect was structural removal of the father from Roman civilization. Stage 1. The first transfer was economic. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were the 2 brothers from a prominent senatorial family who built their political careers on a populist program of land distribution and grain subsidy. Gaius's Lex Sempronia Frumentaria in 123 BC was modest by modern standards. It set a fixed below-market price for grain available to Roman citizens. The state, through state-controlled granaries, sold wheat to a citizen at a subsidy. Initially, the cost was manageable. Initially, the number of recipients was small. But the principle was now established. The state, not the paterfamilias, fed Roman citizens. That principle, the wedge, within 65 years, Clodius's reform of 58 BC, made the grain actually free. Augustus expanded recipient roles. By the mid-1st century, roughly 200,000 citizens in the city of Rome were receiving free state grain. By the 3rd century, the annona had expanded to include oil, wine, and pork. By the late Empire, the same system operated in Constantinople at a similar scale. Here's the structural point. Every Roman father whose household qualified for grain dole was, by definition, no longer the sole provider for his household. The state had inserted itself into the most basic male economic function. The father still went to work. The father still held his other authorities. But the foundation underneath those authorities, the fact that the household's daily survival depended on his labor, had been quietly removed. A father whose family eats whether or not he provides is a different kind of father from one whose family eats only when he provides. The Romans understood this even if they didn't articulate it in those terms. The grain dole was popular precisely because it relieved the burden of paternal economic responsibility. It was also popular among the political class because it created a population dependent on a state distribution, which is to say dependent on the political class. Stage 1 was complete by the late 1st century BC. The provider function of the paterfamilias was now shared in increasing proportion with the imperial state. Stage 2. The second transfer was familial. Augustus, the first emperor, looked at the senatorial class around 20 BC and saw a problem. Senators weren't getting married. Senators who weren't married weren't having children. The Roman elite was depopulating itself in the middle of an expanding empire. His response was a sequence of laws passed between 18 BC and 9 AD. The Lex Papia Papaya. The laws regulated who could marry whom. They penalized men who remained unmarried past a certain age. They penalized married couples without children. They rewarded fathers of 3 or more children with political and economic privileges. The jus trium libitum, the right of 3 children. They limited the inheritance rights of the unmarried and childless. This is the moment that matters most. Before Augustus, household formation was the paterfamilias' domain. After Augustus, household formation was state-regulated. The legal authority of the Patria Potestas was technically still intact, but the state now inserted itself as a co-authority in the intimate masculine domain. The father's authority was now exercised within state-defined parameters. The laws were unpopular. Tacitus describes the resentment they generated. They were also, by most measures, ineffective at solving the demographic problem they were aimed at. But effectiveness wasn't really the point. The point was that the imperial state now claimed jurisdiction over household formation. The claim was never relinquished. Once the state has jurisdiction over household formation, every subsequent generation accepts that jurisdiction as normal. By the second generation after Augustus, Roman citizens didn't remember a Rome where the state didn't intervene in marriage and family law. The intervention had become the baseline. Stage 2 was complete by the early 1st century AD. The household formation function of the Paterfamilias was now under state supervision. Now the first clip. I mentioned those two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. Well, one of the major reform programs they start is what's called the grain dole, meaning that the Roman government for people of a certain class would feed you. And that is a program that Rome is going to have until the mid to late 3rd and then 4th century, where things aren't really doing so well. And then that's going to be something that fuels inflation as well, because one of the things that allows the Roman Empire to rise is something called the Roman climate optimum, meaning from about 200 BC to around 200 AD, they had perfect weather, which allowed for better growing of grapes and olives and grain. And when the Roman Empire itself can't provide for it, well, the annexation of Egypt provides for a lot of that grain. So when the climate changes around 250, the Nile would usually flood every year. And when it flooded, it would make rich soil, and that rich soil would make for grain. Well, the Nile around 250 stops flooding. So now you're going to have grain prices double, triple, quadruple. So now the expense of paying for people eating becomes more, and those people don't know how to provide it for themselves.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
That's the part most people miss when they talk about bread and circus. The bread wasn't moral failure. It was an economic policy whose structural failure mode was built into it from the start. The state took on the burden of feeding a population that had previously fed itself. When the climate changed and the grain failed, the state stole the bread it had promised. The empire couldn't stop feeding people without provoking riots, and it couldn't afford to keep feeding people once the grain dried up. That's a trap. And the trap had been set for 6 centuries by two brothers from a populous family who thought subsidized grain was a kindness. Now the third stage. The third transfer was legal. Across roughly 300 years, imperial law gradually limited Patria Potestas in specific ways. Each limitation was usually justified as protecting the weak, protecting children from abusive fathers, protecting wives from confiscation, protecting property within marriages. Hadrian in the early 2nd century restricted the father's right of life and death, the jus vitae necisque. Constantine in the early 4th century effectively eliminated it. The father who killed his child was now to be prosecuted as a murderer. The right to sell children into slavery, which had been a legal feature of the Patria Potestas from the earliest Roman law, was restricted under Augustus, limited further under Constantine, and effectively gone by the 5th century. The state increasingly intervened in property disputes within households. The state increasingly intervened in inheritance disputes that had previously been the father's domain. The state increasingly intervened in disputes between adult sons and their fathers. Roman law had historically held that a son was under the Patria Potestas for life, regardless of age. Imperial law gradually carved exceptions, then carved more, until the institutional power of the Patria Potestas over adult sons was legally symbolic. Each individual intervention was reasonable. Of course, the state should prosecute fathers who murder their children. Of course, the state should regulate slavery. Of course, adult sons should have legal independence. The cumulative effect was a paternal authority that by the 4th century retained the name of the Patria Potestas, while having lost most of its substance. Stage 3 was complete by Constantine's reforms in the early 300s. The legal authority function of the Paterfamilias was now under direct imperial regulation, the 4th stage. The 4th transfer was civic. By the late Empire, the annona had grown into a comprehensive welfare distribution. Free grain, free oil, free wine, free pork on certain festival days, subsidized housing in some cases, state-distributed entertainment through public games. The city of Rome, and later Constantinople, had become structurally dependent on state distribution for the daily survival of a substantial portion of its population. The civic role that had originally defined Roman masculinity citizen as head of a self-sufficient household, head of a household as provider, provider as basis for political participation, had been hollowed out from underneath. Citizenship was a distribution status, not a productive role. Roman citizens of the 3rd century didn't represent a household to the state. He represented himself as a recipient of state benefits. When the Western Empire fell in 476, the dependency network fell with it. The grain dole stopped. The state distribution stopped. There was no underlying institution capable of absorbing the shock, because the institution that should have been underneath it, the self-sufficient household headed by a productive father, had been hollowed out across 6 centuries of imperial policy. The empire fell. The men were still there. The institution that made them what they were was gone. Stage 4 was complete by the early 5th century. The civic provider function of Roman masculinity had been fully transferred to the imperial state, and then when the state collapsed, transferred to nothing. This is the pattern. 4 stages. Each one looked at the time like a reasonable accommodation. Each one preserved the visible form of the institution. Father still existed. Household still existed. Patria Potestas still appeared in the legal code, while transferring the underlying function to the state. Stage 1 was the grain dole. The provider function transferred from father to state. Stage 2 was the Augustan marriage laws. The household formation function transferred from father to state regulation. Stage 3 was the imperial legal erosion. The legal authority function transferred from father to imperial administration. Stage 4 was the late empire welfare system. The civic provider role of Roman masculinity transferred from father to state distribution. Each stage was downstream of state expansion that solved a real problem. The Gracchi were responding to a genuine economic distress among the urban poor. Augustus was responding to genuine demographic collapse among the senatorial class. Hadrian and Constantine were responding to genuine abuses of paternal authority. The late empire welfare system was responding to genuine urban food insecurity. The state didn't take away fathers because it was malicious. The state took away fathers because every individual intervention was reasonable in isolation. But the cumulative effect across 6 centuries was that institution that had built Roman men no longer functioned. A Roman citizen in 100 BC knew exactly what his role was. He was the head of a household, responsible for its survival, its formation, its religion, its civic participation. A Roman citizen in 400 AD knew that his grain came from the state. His marriage was state regulated. His legal authority over his own household was conditional on state approval. And his civic identity was primarily that of a recipient. He was still Roman. He just wasn't a Roman man in the sense his ancestors would have recognized. And once the institution stops producing the kind of men the civilization needs, the civilization is on borrowed time. The men still exist. They're just shaped by something new. Look at the American household across the last 150 years. In 1875, the American father was a recognizable Roman paterfamilias. He was the household's primary economic representative. Household income flowed through him because the dominant economic structure was the household-based farm or trade. He held legal authority. Laws treated the family as a unit and the father as its representative. He held primary educational authority. Most American children were educated either at home or in a school where parental authority was unambiguously primary. He held primary religious authority. Sunday morning meant the father leading the household to church, and the father leading the family in prayer. He held civic authority. Voting in many states was structured around household representation, and the political participation was understood as a function of household leadership. By 1975, every one of those functions had been partially or substantially transferred to state institutions. The income tax taxed individuals, not households, which weakened household economic unity. Social Security and Medicare replaced sons supporting elderly parents, which broke the multi-generational household. The welfare state replaced fathers as primary providers in low-income households. Exactly the Gracchi grain dole in function. Public schools replaced fathers as primary educators. The credentialed professional class replaced fathers as primary authority on most of life's decisions. No-fault divorce removed legal weight from paternal commitment. The state had become co-authority in marriage, child-rearing, education, and economic provision. By 2025, the cumulative effect is measurable. Fatherless households at historic highs. Marriage rates are at historic lows. Birth rates at historic lows as well. A generation of men who don't know what they're here for, because the institution that was supposed to form them has been hollowed out across the same kind of 4-stage transfer that Rome saw. We're not in late empire territory. America is somewhere in the middle stages. Provider function substantially transferred. Household formation function under state supervision. Legal authority eroded, but not gone. Civic provider role is still partially intact. The system is still functioning. The fathers still exist. But the institution that should be producing the kind of men America needs is not producing them at the same rate the civilization requires. That's not a moral failure of individual men. That's a structural failure of the institution that's supposed to form them. Now the second clip.
But what else can a man do to ensure that we leave this country better for our children and our grandchildren?
Well, I think the pandemic has been a really big part of that in a positive, because it's made a lot of people look at what's actually happening out there and the level of responsibility we have to take. And I think it's a lot of what your show stands for, honestly, that we should be doing. And that's being better fathers, being better in our community, and, practicing our religion, right? I think if you look at kind of one of the biggest things that's happened in the last 50 years is we've become a much less spiritual nation. And a country that is spiritually dead is not one that has much of a future. So I think that's what it really comes down to. And I think education is a really big part of it. My kids are being homeschooled because I'm kind of terrified of what's happening in the school system. So I think as a man, if you're taking responsibility for your small area in the country, and I've spoken to a lot of people about this. I had a conversation with General Mike Flynn about this. I had a conversation with Douglas McGregor about this. And a lot of times people look at kind of the big picture and what's happening in the world and what do we do about the wars and all these other things. But for most people, you're not going to be able to do very much about that. That's the question Ryan was asking. That's the question this whole channel exists to address, not just for Rome, but for what we're living through right now. The honest answer is that the 4-stage transfer that hollowed out the Roman Paterfamilias has been running in America for roughly 110 years. It's not finished. Stage 4, the late empire condition where men are primarily recipients rather than primary producers, hasn't been completed here yet. The window for individual men to rebuild the institution in their own households is still open. Every American man who takes up the role his great-grandfather held, provider, head of household, religious head, civic representative, primary authority in his family's formation, is rebuilding the institution at the same scale where rebuilding is still possible. Not at the federal level, not at the cultural level, at the household level. One household at a time, the same way Rome was originally built. The state can't give you back what the state took, but the state can't prevent you from taking it back either. This is how empires actually take away their fathers. Not in one law, not in one moment, not through any deliberate decision to weaken men, through a 4-stage transfer of paternal function to the state, across centuries, where each individual transfer looks reasonable, and the cumulative effect is hollowing out the institution that made this civilization possible in the first place. Rome ran this full transfer across 600 years. By the time the empire fell, the institution that had formed Roman men for 8 centuries was no longer functioning. The men were still there. What they were for was gone. The question for our moment isn't whether the pattern can run here. The pattern has run in every civilization that's expanded a centralized state across multiple generations. The question is which stage we're already in, and whether enough men decide to rebuild the institution in their own households before the transfer completes. Same playbook, different century. Same result, unless the men inside the pattern reorganize it and refuse to complete it. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. This has been The Roman Pattern. I'll see you Monday.